Thank you, everyone, for tuning in yet again to another episode in which I talk about issues relating to public transportation. And this time, it's a topic that I have been working on for quite a while with other people at TransitMatters, which is our regional rail electrification report. It's already, you can see you can already see this in chat. You can also type in regionalrail.net, redirects to our regional rail plan. And so if you look at, so this is a redirect. So I'm not going to tell people to type in 533B whatever, but if you type in this, transitmatters.org/s/regional rail electrification final.pdf, you're actually going to get redirected to this. And what is this? This is an overview of electrification of trains, because this is very important for large urban regional rail networks. And unfortunately, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been reticent to do so because it's not a common thing in America. Which does not mean that there's no rail electrification in America. Far from it. New York and Philadelphia were both early adopters of electrification. SEPTA Regional Rail is entirely electrified. The LIRR and Metro North are almost entirely electrified, and New Jersey Transit, to a large extent, is electrified as well. It's just that there haven't been a lot of recent projects in the United States. The only big one in the last however many generations is the Amtrak project between New Haven and Boston, which did a few things right, but also it's Amtrak. So there's this hesitancy to wire lines, even in plans that spend equivalent amounts of money on other things, some quite good, like accessibility. So raising the platforms to be level with the trains. This is very important. And New York is so in New York, the Long Island Railroad and Metro North have done that. New Jersey Transit partly has. SEPTA, the all-electric train, really hasn't. Boston, not really either. So in Boston, they're used to this, to these upgrades for these incremental upgrades of platforms from low to high, and that's fine. But electrification isn't something they're used to, so they're trying to be very hesitant and to do it in tiny steps, only a few lines at a time, very short ones. They're leering toward other solutions, kind of anything to avoid wiring just because it looks weird to them. So we're trying to explain why it's actually good and necessary and not actually expensive. So this is not my document. Okay, I worked on it. It's possible that I've contributed the most verbiage, to the most actual text or content to this, but it's not my document in any way, shape, or form. It's a document that I collaborated with other people on. So these are my colleagues at TM. So Peter, Jay, and Ethan, and myself are kind of the core of the regional rail technical program. Ari does a lot of very good technical things about everything. Um, um, Tim so Tim is one of the people on the board who helps run the org. And this is true of Jim, who was the former Secretary of State. Sorry, not Secretary, Secretary of Transportation of Massachusetts. Matt has also been doing a lot of good recent things about regional rail. But let's say Peter and Jay and Ethan and I were doing it, let's say 3 years ago. Josh, again, one of the co-founders of TransitMatters. Jared, our current executive director. Very good at what he does. I have no idea why the color scheme thing is making my computer feel this way. Anyway, so if everything is correct, then you can see my face to the left of the text and not overwriting the text. Looks okay. Looks like that. It looks okay like this, I think. Yell at me in chat if there's any problem. Even when I'm not. I mean, I'm watching chat on my phone, so even if so right now, for example, I'm not staring at OBS. I'm staring at the thing where you can yell at me in chat. So, uh, as I mentioned, the United States does have electrification. New York, for example, was an early adopter. So the first mainline rail electrification in the world was in Paris. Gare d'Orsay, actually, which is currently just a station on the RERC, was part of an extension of the system heading into Gare d'Austerlitz in Paris. So that's trains going from the south. Not southeast, which was Gare de Lyon, but south, like Bordeaux, Toulouse at the time, went to Gare d'Austerlitz. And the commuter trains in that network went deeper into the city center to Gare d'Orsay, which was electrified. This is 1900. New York, in New York, they electrify from the LRR from Brooklyn to Jamaica, I believe 1905. And I believe same year is also Grand Central to the Bronx. And then very quickly, by 1907, they have high voltage catenary, the first in the world possibly, all the way from almost Grand Central, they're connecting to the third rail, to Stamford, Connecticut. Hamburg is also an early adopter with catenary. Hamburg, I believe, was maybe Hamburg was also higher voltage. I don't remember actually. But anyway, so we have these early adopters. By the 1910s, there's London, Philadelphia, much more New York, much more Paris. Berlin starts in the 1920s, I believe. So Hamburg starts 1907, 1908, and maybe high voltage, I can't tell. But anyway, so Boston does not do that. Boston has no electrification. The only parts of the Boston of the Boston commuter rail network that are electrified, so the only part is Providence line, Boston to Providence, and it does not run electric trains. The trains are diesel. In fact, the electrification is missing a few very small parts, like Attleboro. So what does it mean? So what do I mean when I say missing small parts? Boston to Providence is a two-track line, but one of the intermediate stations, Attleboro, has four tracks, two tracks serving the station, which is only used by commuter trains, and two in the center bypassing it, so that intercity trains can overtake slower commuter trains. The speed difference between commuter trains and intercity trains on this corridor is quite large because the commuter trains are very slow due to the use of diesel power. The intercity trains are not very fast, but they're on the fast side by American standards because it's one of the faster parts of the Northeast corridor. So this is Attleboro, and this is the line. So right here, there are four tracks. And the local tracks, the ones that are used by commuter trains, are not actually electrified. But again, it's a tiny amount of work, but it's work. Massachusetts just never bothered doing because they were not interested. So there's no current electrification in Boston, unfortunately, and this makes Boston rather unique among large cities. I guess, I mean, there are other American cities, and there's also Toronto, there's also Montreal, but Toronto is electrifying, which we're going to get to. Los Angeles barely has commuter trains. It doesn't really have public transit. San Francisco, San Francisco actually has a busy by American standards commuter line, but it's also electrifying it. So cities the size of Boston outside North America in the developed world electrified their commuter trains often generations ago. But again, Berlin, we're about the same size as Boston. Maybe we're a little bit smaller. We electrified in the 1920s and 30s. And we weren't even the world's earliest adopter or anything. I mean, we're behind, for example, Tokyo or Hamburg. I think Vienna was ahead of us as well. So the uh, so the point is that electrification reduces the acceleration penalty. Why? Because the trains have more. So there are two things. The first is that electrification, the way it works is that you don't have electric locomotives. You can use electric locomotives if you'd like. It's just very uncommon nowadays. Usually it's more of a legacy thing. So you'll see it a lot in Switzerland, but in Switzerland, the newer trains are getting are not like that. And in general, practically all passenger rail is electric multiple units, or EMUs. All subways are EMUs, so when you're at the subway, there's no locomotive. Okay, I mean, when you're at the subway, you don't see a separate locomotive, right? You see the front of a train, and there's the driver, because all the equipment is under the floor. And this is how EMUs work. Often, every single axle is powered, like all-wheel drive. For medium speed regional rail, it's less common actually. So regional rail EMUs, the ones in America, like the ones that are used in New York and Philadelphia, power every axle. In Japan, sometimes known as Shinkansen, but it's not as common. No, I do not want to buy. I'm highly uninterested in buying from you, so no. So where was I? Right, EMUs. EMUs, again, the typical products in Europe only power about half the axles because because it turns out that the acceleration you need requires only about half the train to be powered. Because I mean, yes, you can always go higher, but then you're dealing with passenger comfort, passenger safety. So they just go up to about 1.3 meters per second squared. And yeah, it's also what Pony's saying, that there's a tendency here toward low floors because we don't have high platforms. So we have level boarding, but we don't have level boarding at the level of American or Japanese trains. So I mean, some of the legacy S-Bahn systems do, like here, like here in Berlin, but it's more common to have platforms at 55 or 76 centimeters. So they often power. So they often power the end cars, let's say the end two cars in a 4-car configuration or something like that. So, and again, that's enough. It's 1.3-ish meters per second squared acceleration. You don't want to go more than that for standee safety and comfort reasons. And second, so that's the multiple unit part. That's not the same as electrification. You can do diesel multiple units. They're just not very good. And then the electric part means that you just have way more power because you don't need to carry the power plant. And it's also why EMUs are better than batteries, because battery things have to carry power plant. So EMUs turns out, so the reason EMUs are essentially taking over the world, like basically every commuter train in the world is an EMU. Basically every intercity train is a high-speed EMU. The main holdouts on high-speed EMUs are, the main holdout is France, to some extent Spain, I think maybe also to some extent Korea. Germany is phasing these out, the electric locomotives out, so it's all EMUs soon. And then there's China and Japan. So, and on regional trains, again, it's the same thing. So essentially, a large majority of world passenger rail ridership is EMUs. Why? Because they're better than literally everything else at everything, except they need wire. Um, so the so this is why uh, this needs to happen. It's become standard practice, even in cities that are a lot smaller than Boston. So this is where we start going over various case studies. So things like Denmark, and I don't mean Copenhagen. Copenhagen electrified the core S-Bahn lines. It's called S-Tog, and from the 1930s because they were imitating Germany at the time. But now they're electrifying the national network. New Zealand is electrifying not the national network, unfortunately, but the Auckland commuter line. It recently wired them. Um, Israel, until recently, had no electrification and is transitioning to an entirely electrified passenger rail system. Not the freight trains, unfortunately. And it's using, so for example, in Israel, the geography is that it's a very dense country. The population density of Israel is one of the highest in the world. There's also no long range lines where you can just put a diesel locomotive and run the train for 2,000 kilometers because you're hitting countries that either don't have diplomatic relations or economic relations with Israel or do, but try to keep it at arm's length. And separately, have you seen the geography between Israel and Jordan? There are a bunch of different reasons, not all geopolitical, why there are no connections to other countries. So that's an isolated network which kind of forces short distances. So this is why they're electrifying. Denmark is connected, but it's connected to electrified systems which encourage electrification. Norway is not doing national electrification. I mean, it's mostly electrified, but right now the system that we're studying is in Trondheim because the Oslo lines, for example, have already been wired. So they're uh, trying to wire. So this is a very cheap cost. So this is about $1.5 million per kilometer, but it's single track. But the lines are mostly single track, I believe. And to some extent it scales, and they run hourly. It's two lines, they both run hourly, and then for a while they run together. So these are the various case studies, and the costs are not especially high. I'm going to jump a little bit and talk more about costs and cases for a sec, which will happen once this actually loads these pages. I'm not sure why they're not loading. Okay, so here are the costs, and again, it's not my document. Were it my document, this would not be in miles. Estonian spy. Does the MBTA use a lot of conductors like the LIRR and SEPTA? Yes. In fact, I think by union agreement, they're required to have a conductor either per 300 passengers or per two cars. So there's this practice in Boston where off-peak, the train is still very long because it's hauled by a diesel locomotive, so the cost of having 4 cars behind and 8 cars behind is basically the same. So they have the full, let's say, 7 or 8 cars behind, and then they block off most of them. Pony, this is a really good question, and we'll get to you in 1 second. But it's an excellent question. It's important for costs. So all of these are lines that are currently are systems that are currently electrifying. And delay does not mean it's not happening. Delayed, I mean, Caltrain will finish electrification soon, for example. And Denmark has had its own delays. So something really important about this. So you can see these costs. Again, they're per mile, so mentally just divide by 1.6. And remember, this is mostly single track. I think this is so this is a combo of single and double. This is mostly double. This is double. This is notional from. This is not from a specific project, which is this footnote. You should probably expect about $2 million per kilometer to be a decent electrification cost. And again, this is just for electrification, and note that these are way higher costs. And I'm gonna get to all of this in a moment. So there are two issues with electrification. The first is extras, and the second is things that just suck. So extras. So Pony was asking, places. Do these places do they just electrify, or do they also do upgrades? You basically always do upgrades because for the most part, if you're electrifying, it's not because you're if you're electrifying usually it's because you're planning on running better service, so you might as well do other things. And these costs can be bundled, and we've unbundled them because we constantly talk about both the cost of electrification and the cost of things to be bundled. We're not saying that Boston should just electrify and do nothing else. No, we think that Boston should also have high platforms for level boarding. That's the big other change, which should cost more than electrification, actually, to some extent. At a few places, and I emphasize a few places, a single track section needs to be doubled. Thankfully, not many because that gets expensive very fast. And so in a few places we're calling for new stations. So it's not like there's nothing. It's just that we're comparing the electrification cost to electrification cost because for other things, again, stations mostly, we have internal numbers. It's something that Boston does. It's something that, upgrading stations and opening new stations. It's something it does decently efficiently, not amazingly well, but decently well. There's an in-house team that does that. They don't do any consultant. They don't privatize it to consultants. They privatize one specific aspect, which is why I said decent, not amazing. But they have in-house capacity for station upgrades. It's something that they're used to. It's only the big things where a heavyweight gets involved where things go haywire. Yeah, so sometimes you electrify and do nothing else because, for example, of this reason, or same thing in Switzerland. Switzerland wired the entire network. Uh, Switzerland wired the entire network in World War II because there was no coal. So they used steam locomotives with the steam power generated by electric heating from the wire rather than coal heating before they then got actual electric trains. So it always means we will also get new electric trains, and that cost can be bundled. It means other upgrades usually. So I believe the Norwegian case is just electrification. Denmark is doing electrification and resignaling. The reason that the reason that they have uncertainty and a bunch of delays is that they could not tell whether to do electrification first and then signals, or the other way around, or both at the same time, and they kept changing their mind. Israel is doing a bunch of extra things. Some of these things are good, some of these are awful, and I will get to them in a moment. And again, this is for all other cases, really, or all others that I'm familiar with. So in Toronto too, by the way, Toronto has a bunch of extras. I'm stripping away the extras. I'm stripping away the extra station. It's just so in Israel. So sometimes the extras are just bad. Okay, we're not talking about station upgrades. Sometimes we're talking about sometimes we're talking. So sometimes with Israel, for example, let me see if I actually brought up the situation in Haifa in this case study. Yeah. So the cost that we're discussing is not just so the cost is not just the electrification. So we're talking about the cost per kilometer, and I'm asserting that it is rather reasonable. There may have been a small overrun since, but it's a small overrun, not a large one. So 262 by 2.2, it's 550. It's not a $550 million project. It's a $3 billion project, except that the rest of the money is not the wires. It's the new trains. It's a lot of double track on lines that are currently single track. It's signaling, and trenching a segment in Haifa. Because you see, Haifa figured that this is the time to thieve other people's money from the state, and the municipality declared that they were against electrification for reasons. They made up reasons. At one point, they said that it would cause carcinogenic radiation. Like it's all in the it's all about coercing the state to give them something, and the state surrendered instead of telling them to fuck the hell off. What they want is they want this section to be trenched in order to let them connect to the beach better. Now, to make it very clear, you see these highways, you see the connection to the beach. Yeah, these block it too. So it's not like there was a beach that the city could enjoy that the train blocked. No, it's the state. It's the not the state. It's the city wanting a new development project and trying to coerce the state to pay for it as a kind of urban renewal thing. No, so if you know anything about Haifa, so this station, Hofa Carmel, it's an infill station. I don't think it existed when I lived in the country 20 years ago. They're trying to make it the new Haifa Central, but that's not the center of Haifa. The center of the city is here. So historically, Haifa had two train stations, Haifa Center and or Haifa Center, and Bat Galim, and and Bat Galim was the busier one. So this and here there's already the neighborhood, and the neighborhood has the beach. It's just that, and you absolutely can cross the tracks. I mean, it's not very pedestrian friendly, but I mean that's the city's decision to be auto friendly. That's a very common thing in Israeli cities. They're not very pedestrian friendly, but instead they've coerced the state into giving them this, and the state actually surrendered, unfortunately. So this means that this line, which is the most important in Israel, is going to be wired last because they're going to trench it instead of telling Haifa no. And this is generally going to be a problem whenever you're electrifying too late. The benefit cost ratio is going to be high enough that various local actors are going to use this as a way of extorting benefits. The state needs to be very firm and very aggressive in saying no. It's not a problem in Trondheim. So these Norwegian cab videos about single tracks. I mean, yeah, Trondheim is not electrifying too late. Trondheim is exactly where it should be electrifying. It's a tiny place. The metro area of Trondheim is 500,000 people. Remember how I said Israel is one of the highest population density countries in the world? Norway, as you can expect, is one of the lowest density. Now, the low density also means that they have very cheap hydropower, because low density in a wet place, and I mean, it's very far north, but it also means not a lot of evaporation, so it means lush hydroelectric resources. It's the same in Canada, by the way. So Norway, for example, has essentially no greenhouse gas emissions from electricity because it's all hydro. And Sweden is hydro and nuclear. Sweden is not as hilly, and it's maybe a little bit denser than Norway. So the upshot is that in Norway there isn't much surplus to extract. In Israel there is more, and the worst is in Canada, and but it's not some kind of economic law of nature. If there's surplus to extract, it will be extracted. No, you can always say no. It just requires understanding that you have this problem and actually going ahead and saying no to people. So in Israel, where they should have said no was the trenching in Haifa. And they also have problems with Boston. This was not a very smoothly run project. It's just not a very expensive one. So that's an example of an extra that should not be there, the trenching. And this gets us to Toronto, because Toronto is a very high cost case, specifically because it's just a matter of surplus extraction. So they added 100% contingency. They spent $1 billion Canadian on noise walls when electrification would reduce noise emissions, because among the many benefits of electric trains over diesels is they are less noisy. There's no diesel engine that makes a lot of noise. If you've lived anywhere in the United States, or if you've stayed anywhere in the United States or Canada near a passing diesel freight train, you've heard the noise. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And this can be gone completely. People don't hear much faster passenger trains that are electrically powered when they're on the same lines. And yet, in Toronto, a bunch of NIMBYs wanted noise walls instead of explaining patiently that no noise walls are needed, and then for the people who are unconvinced, the response is tough. They just given them the $1 billion for noise walls. They don't care. At one point, the benefit cost ratio was going to be 8. It looked outlandish, so it just added more costs until it was more reasonable. And it gets to the point that they do infill in Toronto at something like 4 times the cost of or 5 times the cost of Boston. And again, Boston is not a cheap city, so if you're building infill stations at 4 times Boston costs, you're doing something deeply, and I mean deeply, wrong. And in Toronto's case, they don't care. They just stopped caring. Caltrain is even more expensive, but Caltrain has its own bespoke problems. So this is the main issue with the comparison. This is the main issue with the importance of cost control. And what we think the cost is going to be is on this table. So it's about $1 billion total, right? Because it's about 200-ish times 5 plus a bit extra. It's about 1.1. Yeah, NIMBYs. Like, the important thing about NIMBYs is that they're not rational. They're making demands. They are boundedly, like, the whole point of NIMBY, of like middle class delinquency, let's call it. So I mean things like anti-vax, and I don't mean like the French anti-vax, which is more working class rock throwers. I mean the German version or the American version of, like, Gun, Ken, and Karen, right? The lawyers, I think called McCloskeys, the ones who were caught on camera going at BLM protesters with guns. They're lawyers. So it's kind of like, as middle class people trying to take their high status in society into other realms of which they know nothing. So they are behaving irrationally based on their own interests sometimes. So this is, for example, where they're against vaccinations. It's where they often make demands of schools that are very superficial, so that reduces the quality of education. It's a lot about things that look intuitive to them, but are not actually good. So NIMBYism in this case needs to be understood as a kind of middle class delinquency. So yeah, obviously sometimes they're for the same thing and sometimes they're against it. It's a random irrational thing. To the extent that there's a rational thing to it, is they want to slow down things, to make things harder, to make things more to make any changes to the status quo politically costlier and economically costlier, in order to coerce the state into paying benefits to them. In this case, giving them, I don't know how do you say kutsi in English? It's kind of like giving them more attention, and then sometimes it can be weaponized at the community level into community benefits. Again, the trenching in Haifa, it's not worthless. It has very little value, and Haifa has been making other moves that do not sound like it actually cares about a good pedestrian experience. But the trenching has value to Haifa. It just does not. It just the value of trenching to Haifa to Haifa is disproportionate to the cost. It's just that Haifa is getting other people's money for it. So it's really important to suppress this kind of localism, which again, middle class delinquencies. That's the best way to explain this, I think. And so this is why it's really important to fight back, especially in situations of high surplus. Again, this is about 1.1. We give the range as 800 to 1.5 billion. 800. Remember, I kept talking about 2 million ish per kilometer, based on this, based on this table. Again, you can go below that. So Denmark, it's maybe a little more than 2 for 2/3 double track, 1/3 single track. Norway is mostly single track and it's 1.5. Auckland is, I think, a mix. Israel is a mix. But the commuter rail in Boston is not entirely double track. Their systems are extensively single track. I mean, it's not mostly single track. I think it's probably majority double track, but a small majority. So Lowell is double, but Haverhill is mostly single. Fitchburg is double. Eastern is probably a max. I didn't even bring this up here. Old Colony is mostly single. Double, double. I forgot about it. It's too short to matter. So for the long lines, it's probably, I'm gonna guess 50-50 ish, maybe 60-40 double. So you can go below what we said, but you can also go above, which is why we're giving a factor of 2 range, because there are always little things. It's really important, again, to hold the line. So an important extra that is going to be demanded and the state needs to hold the line on, is bridges. So all bridges in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts over the commuter trains have enough clearance for wire. The lowest bridge that I know of is on the Haverhill line. It's 16 feet 4 inches, which is 4 point, I believe, 6 meters, right? It's almost 5 meters. Clearance to high voltage catenary, depending on the rules. If you're using German rules, it's going to be this. But if you're using British rules, it's going to be this. And there absolutely exist trains that meet that, like even this. So TGVs are 4.32 meters. So you have 10 centimeters to play with for double deck TGVs. Single deck is going to be trivially easy, but even double deck is possible. However, the freight lines that run something like 4 trains per day are going to complain. It's important to hold the line and say, nope, this is the clearance that we're using. You're not running double stack freight on that line. You want to double stack. You want to raise the bridge for double stack freight. You pay your own way. And it's really important because there are parts of Massachusetts DOT that already think that giving corporate welfare to freight rail is a social goal for the state. So that's an example of an extra. It's not going to cost. The thing is, it's not by itself going to cost that much to raise the bridges. I mean, it's going to make the cost of Haverhill line electrification much higher, but that is not going to. But the Haverhill line is just one of many. But one surrender here, one extra there, and suddenly we're talking about a lot of money. So this is why I keep stressing things like suppression of NIMBYism, suppression of localism, and avoidance of extras. And again, there are extras that are good. We're costing them elsewhere in the plan. Things like high platforms, things like the minimal amount of double track that is necessary or triple track, based on the timetables. And again, and sometimes the extras are just forced by geography. In Britain, the bridges are low. They're not just normal low; they're arched low. So you can put the wire in the center very easily, but the pantograph is flat, and that has actually been a problem. Again, but that's a UK specific problem. So and the coast we cite are not where they had that problem. So this is what we think is on the cost side. Again, 1.1 could be a bit more, could be a bit less. At 2 billion, I would start questioning the sanity of the people in charge. And again, it's very easy to mess up managerially if you don't care, or if the MBTA does not know how to run electrification, which it unfortunately doesn't. It's getting people who kind of know, but it's getting British people, not, let's say, Germans or French or Koreans or Spaniards or Danes or Norwegians or Austrians. I can keep listing countries. Uh, so it's important again to get the management right, to avoid to avoid surrendering to local extortion. Um, so for example, there might be an base. I mean, I don't think there will be because there wasn't much in the 90s, but you never know. I mean, surplus always creates this kind of mentality. Huh. Wait, what do you mean there's a trolley bus and they couldn't? Because they didn't know how to have wires cross each other. First of all, if it's just one crossing, the train you can have a dark side. You can have a that's not gonna be that shouldn't be a problem. Because the if the trolley wire is high enough, then the train does not need to be wired across because that's a very narrow segment. It's like what 20 meters or 30 meters at most for road crossing. You can coast. That's fine. That's actually how they deal with voltage changes, because the TGV. France has two different voltages: high voltage and low voltage. So every TGV is at the minimum by current. So what they do at the boundary is they coast, and they coast a lot, across much more than the crossing. But also, but also trolley buses cross other trolley buses. There are way. I mean, I don't know if it's common for mainline rail, but trolley buses do this with like the wire all the time. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, okay. It also exists in Košice. Wait, if it was in Košice, why couldn't they do it in Pilsen? I mean, it was the same country at the time. Yeah, so I mean, but again, you can do a neutral section. That's not a technically hard problem. Crossing a trolley bus. At any rate, um, there are issues with signaling, which actually Massachusetts is doing okay on, like their PTC, a automatic train protection. In America, it's called positive train control, PTC. Their PTC system is actually a decent one called Access, which is an Alstom vendor locked version of what they're doing Europe wide. I mean, maybe it's a generation behind, but I mean, LZB in Germany is 2 generations behind ATCS, and it's still better than anything that runs in North America. Um, so that was the cost. So let's talk about benefits. And so there are a bunch of benefits, some of which are easier to quantify than others. So there are the environmental benefits. So things like noise, pollution. So air. I don't think we talked about noise here very much, unfortunately, but we did talk about air quality. Uh, and this is and we have a bunch of references to this. So Boston has this rather weird situation in which it has an underground station with diesel. It's not something you should ever do. A lot of early electrification efforts came from the need to tunnel. So the way it worked was they needed to tunnel to get to city center, and that was the impetus for electrification in both Paris and New York. The state law on this required electrification to avoid too much steam emissions in Grand Central, in the city in general, but Grand Central, the underground terminal, was specifically a problem. They did that to get to Penn Station, and maybe there's less of a pressure when it's diesel, not steam, but there's still quite a lot of it. And yet in Boston, um, the first station outside of Sound Station is called Back Bay. It is the city's second downtown. Um, it's still actually a bigger downtown than things like Kendall Square, which is at this point the region's third downtown. So this is the main downtown, second downtown. I think at this point this is the third, fourth. It's called Longwood. Fifth is the Seaport. So the station is actually underground. The tracks, and parts of the tracks are exposed to the air, but the platforms themselves are not. And the Amtrak trains are electrified, but the commuter trains are not, and that leads to air quality problems for people standing on the platform. And they've had to build a mechanical ventilation system to deal with that. So it's still basically much cheaper than electrification, but it's money, and there's still a pollution problem. That's not solve the pollution problem. That's reduce the extent of the pollution problem at one station. So that is something that's quantifiable, but not easily. Mostly because it's hard to disaggregate how much of the pollution is from the trains versus from other sources. Or hell, electrifying the trains is going to reduce air pollution, not just because the trains are going to be cleaner, but much more importantly, because the trains are going to be better. They're going to have higher performance. And what does this mean? If the train has higher performance, it means that it is going to induce more ridership. And it's the same as true of reliability. Reliability is probably the hardest to quantify with everything else, just because it's hard to tell how much of premium passengers put in reliability. Best you can do is try to convert reliability to speed by thinking in terms of schedule padding. All electric systems, you pad the complex system 7%. A less complex system, like a back and forth high speed line with no track sharing with anything else, you can do it a lot. You can get away with a lot less. I think JR East was advising 4% for California high speed rail. So if you do 7%, which is a very complex system like Switzerland, that's still not a lot. I've seen 15%. I mean, American electric trains also pad a lot because they don't really go for reliability-centered design for their timetables. That is to say, they don't think how to systematically eliminate sources of delay, even when they do have high platforms, or they get schedules that are too fragile sometimes. So this is where you have LIRR lines that have 30% schedule padding. But that's unusual. More common is 15, 20. And if you have reliability center design, which means electrification, just because electrics are so much more reliable, the older diesels and the MBTA series, they have 4-figure mean distance between failures. The newer ones are low, I guess to mid in kilometers, 5 figures, maybe. EMUs, I think at some point you can even hit 7 figures, but that's uncommon. It's normally just 6 figures. So not 3 orders of magnitude, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude better. One order of magnitude better than the newest, best diesels. So this means that passengers are just going to be able to rely on the service. They're not going to be constantly missing work, for example, or missing appointments. I mean, you guys who are watching me, you know how, for example, my computer is not reliable. Why is my computer not reliable? Because it is a because it was in 2016 a new Lenovo, a new ThinkPad, but in 2021, it is not new. As I keep saying on video, I keep going like this. It's about to get an invitation to go to school. So and you can see how the poor reliability of things like the interface with the microphone, with the headset, how it's causing problems with the stream. And it's the same thing with trains, except with trains, I mean, it's not like someone can apologize and say, sorry, let's just move to the other microphone and back and it's 20 seconds. No, it's people are going to be late to work, sometimes by half an hour, sometimes by hours at in the worst cases. That is not an acceptable situation. And passengers clearly state a premium for reliability. They clearly pay better for reliability. Again, it's hard to quantify in terms of any kind of cost-benefit ratio because how much extra people can pay, that's at quantitative level actually really hard to gauge when you think about it as a system-wide thing and not as a bunch of different competing airlines or bus services. But but it's something that's a very clear benefit, and you can see more ridership coming out of it, and more ridership. Again, we talked about the environmental issues. What does more ridership on trains mean? It means less driving. What does less driving mean? It means less pollution. It means fewer car accidents. So these are benefits that are very large and also imperfect to quantify. I'm not saying they're impossible to quantify, but there are going to be error bars. And then there are the things that are easy to quantify, which are led by life cycle costs, because EMUs are also cheaper to operate on top of being just better. This is not some kind of really high end thing that is really good, but also supremely expensive. Like, I mean, I guess Czechia is landlocked and no navy, but like my country is not landlocked. I'm sure my country would love to have 10 aircraft carriers, but aircraft carriers cost money. Money in Germany goes to things that are not aircraft carriers, like building more roads, keeping the autobahn without a speed limit. So so maybe we cannot have in an 80 million person country a navy that is the same size as a 330 million person country that is already excessively militarized. But you can kind of see that like aircraft carriers are like maybe a nice asset for a navy, but really expensive to buy and maintain. EMUs are not expensive to buy and maintain. Yeah, the wires cost money, but the wires cost money per kilometer of track. This is a regional rail system. It's very intensively used. It's intended to be very intensively used for relatively short distance travel. So other than the wires, all other parts of the system are really cheap. The train sets are cheaper than all alternatives. Essentially, they've started to become commoditized. I emphasize started. They're still not really off the shelf. There's progress in that direction with modularity of design, and I think that's done a lot to keep a lid on prices over the last 20 years. But again, this is not a commodity or anything like that. It's not like buying a car. Cars is practically a commodity. As long as you don't buy Skoda. Yeah, sure. Trust me, there are worse things than buying a Skoda tram. Or do you mean the Skoda cars from like before the end of the Cold War? But anyway, EMUs are cheaper. They're also much cheaper to operate and maintain. Because so a little bit of that is energy costs, but it's not like the electricity is that expensive. No, the problem is maintenance. And the thing is, diesel engines rattle a lot. A diesel bus lasts 12 to 15 years. In the United States, the FTA replaces buses every 12 years. So this means that if you keep your buses for 12 years, then you can apply for a federal grant for capital investment on replacing the bus. By the way, it's going to be at a large premium over European bus prices. But so it's 12 years, and in Canada, for example, which has the same fleet essentially, but not the same funding, they maybe stretch it a little bit more to, let's say, 14, 15 years. That's it. The buses are not going to survive longer. The buses already, I mean, we talked about mean distance between failures before. I believe in New York, the mean distance between failures on the subway is 200,000 kilometers, or maybe a little less. It's 100 and change thousand miles, maybe 170, 180,000 kilometers. On the buses, it's four figures in miles, so either high four figures or five figures, of which the first one is a one in kilometers. That's buses. Buses have like diesel engines break down all the time. And yeah, part of it is bus versus train, but not entirely. Boston has trolley buses. Boston is one of not many American cities that have retained trolley buses, which the MBTA is busily trying to throw away and replace with battery electrics. But the trolley buses, they're 30-year-old trolley buses because they don't have the parts that break down the most. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So buses have these vibrations. Trolley buses to some extent have vibrations because of the roads. I mean, I know people with chronic pain who cannot ride a bus. I mean, you put them on a bus, even trolley bus, 15 minutes, and they're going to be in pain the entire day afterward. And it turns going to be a lot better. But the diesel is, in addition, a problem. It's not just, and part of it is the fumes, but also the effect it has not just on the people, but also on the spare parts, the engine. So you're just going to have way higher costs for diesels. Yeah. There are 60-year-old electric locomotives. The New York City subway has trains called the R32s that were supposed to be thrown away by now, but somehow keep surviving longer than newer trains, like the R40, R42, R44. R32, built from 1964 to 1965. It is still running. I guess they're I guess at this point they're only doing some for work service. Overall in mishaps, retirement. Made its final trip on October 8, 2020. Built 64 to 65. So they didn't quite last to retirement age, but there are workers at the MTA who get their pension at a younger age than these trains. Because the MTA, because the standard in the American public sector is 30 years, and then some unions manage to negotiate it down to 25 years of service, and then you get a pension, and then you're retired full pension. So if you started at probably not straight at 18. Usually it's early 20s. Usually you did. It's not like it's not people who go to college, but it's people did other things on the way. So yeah, they retire in their early 50s. Yeah. It's not true that modern EMUs don't seem to last as long. No, modern EMUs last. You can stretch a modern EMU 40, 50 years. It's just that usually a place that runs modern EMU. I mean, a 45-year-old EMU is not going to be reliable. The R32s in New York, because they clearly were not meant to last longer than about 45 years. So in the last 10 years, they've had the worst reliability in the system. They had the worst mean distance between failures, something like 50,000 kilometers or something like that, or 60,000 kilometers. So but in their last 2 years, they were falling apart. The only reason they were in service is because of some weird thing that they had to take out other cars out of service for some reason, but they were already on their way out. So usually, so the point is that if you have modern EMUs, usually the sort of places that run modern trains also are going to replace them promptly, which is after 45 years. But no, we're comparing 45 years with it. So a diesel train isn't going to last only 15, but it's going to last 20, 25, and it's going to require a lot more maintenance. I think 30 is maybe the maximum for diesel before it's just going to fall apart. And so EMUs are just so it's not just that you need to replace them less frequently, their normal maintenance cost is better. And this is the analysis that I managed to get, which required using other people's academic access at one point. Uh, so it's a Railway Gazette article from that I put in there before Railway Gazette went entirely behind the paywall, but also you read the benchmarking study, and again, it's a weird study, but the cost of an EMU at the life cycle is half that of a DMU. And if you're wondering about DMU versus diesel locomotive, the answer is that at the typical length of the Boston commuter train, which is 8 cars, they're about the same. Shorter trains, for shorter trains, it's better to do DMU. For longer trains, it's better to do a locomotive if it's diesel. Yeah, diesels can get a midlife replacement, but EMUs get. I mean, that's no. What I'm saying 30 years with midlife refurbishment, and EMUs get 40, 50 with midlife refurbishment. So this is where I'm talking about the factor of two difference. And so this means the cost. So let's try to figure out costs. Okay, costs, especially when it comes to rolling stock, are driven entirely by the peak, because maintenance costs are largely per are largely per unit of time, not kilometer driven. I mean, a train that you drive 200,000 kilometers a year will require more maintenance than one that you drive 50,000, but by a factor of far less than four. It's digressive to the point of being flat. So and this is also a benefit of EMUs being faster. You need fewer of them for the same frequency. So all combined, it's about a factor of about two. And I can tell you the cost of, let's say, procurement, maintenance, these kinds of operations. So without the crew, for example, or the cleaning, it's about $1 per car kilometer. And when you convert that to an annual saving, every kilometer you electrify is going to cost you 1.5 to, let's say, $2.7 million double truck, and then every car hour at the peak, because costs again they're driven by the peak, fleet size is driven by the peak, maintenance is largely by the peak. That is going to be about what did they say here? So here's at 20,000 per mile. So that would be about 12,000 or 13,000 per kilometer. So per so for every car, it's about 0.5%, maybe a little less than 0.5% in financial ROI just on maintenance, because it's 13,000 way 2.7, let's say 2.7 million. Yeah. And I think this is an upper estimate. So you can even go a little. So I said 3.5% for an 8-car train. You could go a little bit lower, but not much lower. I think 3% maybe is the minimum. Maybe 8% is a very aggressive number. More typical would be, I guess, 4, maybe 5%. So the point is, take the number of trains you're running. Again, this is based on the peak. So you take how many cars they're running. It's U.S. size car, not European size car, which is smaller. For every car, it's about 0.4-ish, maybe 0.5% financial ROI. So if you're running an 8-car train every hour, it's probably about 4%. If you're running 4 per hour, let's say a train every 15 minutes, which is actually pretty common in the Boston area, then it's 16%. So this is a 16% financial return on investment counting exclusively the life cycle cost and the maintenance, and then and ignoring the massive environmental benefits, the massive benefits to passengers in more reliability and higher speed. This is how amazing we're talking about, and this is why the frontier of electrification is things like Trondheim. Trondheim, again, it's a train every hour. I don't think it's a long train every hour. And yes, it's in a lower cost country, but and it's also a wealthy country, so the benefits may be a little bit higher to the passengers. Just but again, the frontier at the end of the day is a train every hour, and not a long one. Boston is a train every 15 to 20 minutes at the peak. They should have electrified a generation ago. Essentially, what we're proposing right now for TransitMatters is a way. In what context can Norway be called a lower cost country? In the sense that its construction costs are very low. Not all of them. The Fornebu-banen is very expensive, $200 million per kilometer at PPP. Mind you, still better than anything in Germany. But that was because they mined the station. So they used the same pathology as Second Avenue subway in New York City, $200 million per kilometer. Without that, the Leuven line was 90, maybe 100 million per kilometer. Yeah, all Polish workers. Yeah, the workers tend to be immigrants, but I mean, the workers in Germany tend to be immigrants. The workers, hell, the workers in Poland are increasingly immigrants from Ukraine and Belarus. Like everyone talks about how Poland is like a country that like preserves the purity of the race or whatever alt-right bullshit. No, but Poland is an immigration country. Peace doesn't like it, but I mean, there are many things in Poland that peace does not like. I'm sure in Czechia you have Ukrainian and Belarusian workers. Hell, in Turkey the workers are typically Turkish, but the construction workers, there's an increasing trend in which the construction workers are Syrian and Afghan refugees. And Turkey is also a lower cost country, but it's not. But it's not a matter of using immigration for race suppression. They just are very efficient at it, because when you have Norwegian wages, when you have Swedish wages, you will work with the minimum number of workers that are safely required. You will not do American bullshit of using a million supervisors because that's what you're used to. No, you're gonna you're gonna economize. So yes, Norway is a lower cost country for construction in general, but specifically, I'm staring at electrification costs that I verified not recently. When I verified them when we started working on this, which was the very beginning of Corona, and yet, seriously, this is a real cost. So this is why I'm saying Norway is a lower cost country. The railway electrification is because maybe the electrician. I guess because electricians are higher skill. Because in Germany, we have an increasing number of Syrian electricians, but it's taking them years to get there. Like they needed to learn the language and they need to get certified. Took them maybe 4 years. So by 2019. Railway construction. Yeah, but tunneling. So maybe the mining is also specialized, but all the other construction work, my understanding is they're using immigrants. And I know that even for the tunneling in Sweden, they use domestic migrants. They don't use native Stockholmers. Whereas in New York, it's native New Yorkers. I mean, maybe people who live in Long Island or maybe in outer parts of the city that are still the city but hate the rest of the city. But the UK has its problems. Mostly the UK, mostly Boris needs to just have like do a ritual in which he comes to Brussels and asks for forgiveness and says that he will immediately open the borders with the union and invite Romanians and Bulgarians. You too have seen the cartoons about Coast Guard. Pointing machine guns at the raft full of refugees, asking them, "Can anyone here drive a lorry?" Um, so, um, So in conclusion, immigrants actually have valuable skills to contribute to the economy, contra Boris. However, regardless of this, there's immigration all over Europe. Norway just manages to work more efficiently than, for example, Denmark. And this is also something you can see in their subway construction costs. Denmark's are the worst in Scandinavia, unfortunately. Still better than like world average, but I mean, that's like Anders Stagnell saying that he did not fail because the death toll in Sweden is lower than in countries where every person under the age of 35 lives with their mother. Any recommendation which countries are? It doesn't really matter. I mean, just hire more people. Like, I mean, electrification, like electricians are not like, I mean, electricians. It's not like being a Navi where you just find someone who's been displaced by enclosures and they will work as a Navi. But it's also not like, I don't know, managing a team at a profitable tech firm where not everyone actually has that skill. Now, the United States does have a problem in which it's really bad at using immigrant labor for public works, because of the whole jobs problem, and they don't even use domestic migrant labor. And one of the recommendations that is very likely to be in our report about construction costs is to nationalize the market, which in English means lay off all the native New Yorkers who demand ridiculous benefits and replace them with Mississippians and West Virginians. But again, that's a secondary issue. Like the labor is not the dominant part of high American costs. Again, it has a role to play, but the problem with Caltrain is not that they're paying the workers too much. The problem with Caltrain is that they built the signals at a place that conflicts with. They built the fiber optic for the signal system at a place that conflicts with the masts, and because they and the managers enjoy micromanaging. So if you need to move the masts by a little bit because the place where you intended to put the mast is where the fiber is, then you need some honcho approval rather than just moving the mast by a little bit. And I think they also have denser mast spacing than is typical, but please don't quote me on that. And their rolling stock and their rolling stock procurement sucked so much that they paid a rather large premium because the managers had no clue what they were doing. Stadler had a lot of complaints about this. So this is so again, the labor. I mean, is labor a problem in the northeastern United States? Yes. Is it the dominant problem? No. Uh, so at any rate, the so before when Sanjay was talking about Norway being a lower cost country and a higher wage country, so this matters because it means that the benefits of infrastructure in isolation are higher in Norway. What does this mean? It means that the frontier of Norwegian infrastructure is that they're building subway extensions and and they have a regional rail tunnel in Oslo, which is a very small which is a small metro area, and they're electrifying regional trains in Trondheim. Boston is not the frontier. Boston is a metropolitan area that is at the scale of the reach of the commuter trains, I think 15 times bigger than Trondheim. Trondheim, the built up urban area, is not 500. I think it's 270. 500 is the entire region. When Boston, you look at the entire region, you have to go as far as Rhode Island, Worcester. We're not including New Hampshire in the report, but we're talking about the prospects of extensions there if the state ever wants to spend money on anything. That's an 8 million person region almost, maybe 7 million person region. Uh, there aren't European metropolitan areas that size except London, Paris, Randstad, which is too multi-core, the Rhine-Ruhr, which is too multi-core. Madrid maybe is 6 point something. So these are some impressively large cities in the United States that are unelectrified, or in New York's case, not completely electrified, or in Chicago's case, barely electrified. Yeah, Trondheim is again, I've never been there, so I'm not gonna use my typical, so I'm not gonna say, oh, it's a village. I'm sure based on its size, it's a village, but again, I've not been there, so it's not like I can give you anecdotes about how it's a village. Whereas I will say that Leipzig comes off to me as a small city. Berlin is mid-sized. So Leipzig has an electrified system and also a city center tunnel for the S-Bahn, which has actually been used. So I keep slagging on Americans for not knowing that other countries exist. I will give credit where due. The North-South railing people are aware of the existence of Leipzig. I believe that one of their examples in this is the Leipzig city tunnel. And the regional rail thing we're proposing is not in conflict with NSRL. It's essentially electronics before concrete. This is concrete. You do the electronics right, and then it's not instead of concrete. You see, Leipzig City Hall. And the Stockholm City Bahn, which is very good. Westlänken, which I'm working on right now. Durchmesserlinie is the second line in Zurich. This may be not so good because New York and very high costs. Ottawa has problems as well. But so the point is, they actually do know things about other places. And Leipzig, that's a metro area of a little more than 1 million people. I mean, talking about the size of a metro area in Germany is always weird because we don't have contiguous sprawl the way America does, or all of Asia, or France, or Spain. So instead it's Leipzig, but also Halle, people commute from there to Leipzig, or Berlin's actually an atypically monocentric city, but or something like I don't know. Mannheim is actually is on the polycentric side. So it's Mannheim, but you also have Heidelberg, and you have Worms, and you have Speyer, and even Ludwigshafen is clearly the same urban area as Mannheim, but is a distinct urban center. And yeah, and then the S-Bahn, to the extent that you can call the Mannheim commuter trains S-Bahns, goes as far as Karlsruhe. So, but it's but with that caveat, with Leipzig, it's about 1.2-ish million people, and they have a tunnel. So that would be like if Providence had a tunnel, in addition to multiple tunnels in Boston representing, let's say, Berlin. And so the and so so Boston is on the frontier. Boston is like if you had a city the size of Berlin or a little bit larger in a much denser region than East Germany, but with the infrastructure of Dresden, let's say. Not even Leipzig. So anyway, that's our electrification report and how it feeds into other things. So the cost, the benefits, again, these are enormous benefits. This is why I'm worried about surplus extraction. This is why I'm worried about NIMBYs demanding noise walls that they shouldn't get because, again, this reduces noise, or people are demanding trenching where that's completely inappropriate, or freight railroads trying to run the entire project because they think that they own tracks that are actually owned by the public sector. So this is, again, so we're talking 16% maybe, or on the busier lines 20, and maybe the less busy lines 10 to 15% financial ROI, which is amazing. I mean, nothing has. I mean, usually if someone tells you that they have a 20% ROI, that's a scam, and this is 15, maybe 20% ROI, and it's a public project, so there are also social benefits for less congestion, fewer car accidents, less pollution, less noise pollution. More ridership is also going to have its own financial benefit just because the state's not going to need to subsidize these trains. So this needs to be done, and this needs to happen, 70 years ago. But if that's not, but because we can't go back in time, so the next best is now. And I'm going to take questions if anyone has any. I may And do warn people that my phone is a 1% battery, which is not going to matter for my computer, but my phone is how I know whether my chat my phone is where I look at chat when I'm not in front of this. So it is likely that in 5 minutes, if my sound goes down, I will not know this immediately, for which I apologize. Any thoughts about India's electrification program? Ooh, I wish I knew. So I know how cheap. So it's incredibly cheap. So we don't include India in this because it's a developing country, and all I know is the cost. I don't know any of the details. The cost is very low, even if you take into account PPPs. I believe in PPP terms, India is electrifying for about $500,000 or $600,000 per kilometer. So substantially less than the lowest I know. Now, I don't know the cost in South Korea. I've asked and couldn't get a real answer. I don't know the cost in China either. We're looking at both. But I'm stymied by things like lack of available information in English, and this is not a mega project. Now, the scope of the program is vast, but it is not as visible a mega project as the construction of a new subway line or the construction of a new high-speed rail line, and therefore it is not as easy to find the information in the trade press. So this is why I don't know the cost in China and Korea. And India, I do know them, and they're very low, and it's a very good thing that IR is doing. And the contrast between the very low cost of things that are done domestically by IR using its own native knowledge, and the very high cost of very visible things that are often outsourced to foreign consultants, like the high-speed rail project from Mumbai to Ahmedabad and Surat, or the metro lines that are following the example of Delhi, which was very consciously trying to imitate rich Asia. Things like Japan mainly. So this is a very good thing, and the people doing project management on at least from what I know from the cost data, the people doing project management on rail electrification at IR, they need a raise and they need promotions. But again, I can't tell you more in detail about what they've done. I can make guesses about what they've done, but all I know is what the press says about the costs and what is happening. So you can type in chat if you have more follow-up questions. And I'm gonna take Borner. Oh, sure, your problem. Not your problem, no problem. Where should battery EMUs go? Nowhere. Honestly, I mean, maybe very low, right? I mean, Norway is doing that. So battery EMUs are what you do. So battery EMUs have the performance of DMUs. I do not know how much they cost to maintain. I know how much they cost to procure. It is a large premium over normal electrics. I want to say factor of two, but it's not a clean comparison because it's a comparison of a mixed order to a pure EMU order, so there's an error bar. And I'm told it's not a factor of two, it's less than that, maybe 1.5. But 1.5 is still a lot. And you're not getting the performance benefits, and I do not know the cost of maintenance, but batteries are not free to maintain. Whereas catenary, to a large extent, is. So where should BEMUs go? Maybe frontier places, but not Trondheim. Norway is doing that. Yeah, maybe rural. Yeah, so they're trying to. So I'm forgetting whether in rural Saxony they're trialing batteries or hydrogen. Hydrogen looks. I mean, maybe hydrogen will succeed in the future, but so far it's not succeeding. There's even a. There was even this automaker that tried to be the next Tesla. They even call themselves Nikola, except Tesla has a product. I mean, a product that's overhyped and overrated, but a product that works. You can drive it. Apparently, Nikola couldn't even get Nikola was a scam. It turned out their hydrogen car, the demonstration they were showing, they were just using camera angles. The car was actually driving the car was actually in neutral going downhill. And hydrogen trains cost a lot more than battery trains. The main advantage is that fuel cell is very energy dense. Unlike batteries, have low energy density, so you need to constantly recharge them. So you do not want to use batteries on high performance lines because that will degrade the battery fast. You don't want to use them in the cold because the battery will run down. You want to use them on low performance, low ridership lines where for some reason you can't wire. You probably should be wiring, to be honest. Norway is doing batteries. Where is it doing batteries? On the line that on the spine that goes north south to Bodo, which is the northern end of the Norwegian rail network and is north of the Arctic Circle. So yeah, this line they were trying to. So this line used to run diesel locomotives, and then they tried to make it more efficient by running DMUs. But DMUs, unlike EMUs, are not comfortable for passengers to ride because the rattly diesel engine is not nice to ride over. So they went back to diesel locomotives, and now they're doing batteries there because the line is partly wired. So this is Bode. Look at this. Stare at this is altitude 10 kilometers, maybe. This is the size of the town. I mean, you can also look at Wikipedia at how big it is. So compare this, and you might even see on Zoom that it's not very dense. It's houses, couple apartment buildings with houses, townhouses, and let's compare this with any city that we're actually familiar with. Let's do Berlin, not even Paris. And let's stare at Berlin at the same scale. So the entirety of Bode would fit in Friedrichshain, give or take. And Friedrichshain is apartment buildings, not houses. So yeah, this is so an intercity line through Norway, where that is the northern anchor. Yeah, that is where you're doing batteries. Yeah, ditto Tohoku region, which in the long run is mostly just where people say they came from, where they live in Tokyo. But Japan actually lags electrification, I suppose, whereas Korea is fully wired. I mean, not fully wired, but is about to be fully wired. Yeah, if you're measuring your traffic by trains per day, not trains per hour, you might want to consider not doing EMUs. Otherwise, okay, I would not compare this because this is if it's a new line that's being built, then it's going to be cheaper than a line that's already existing, where they're going to need to deal with issues of where they're going to need to deal with, for example, nighttime closures, so nighttime windows. So if it's a line that already pre-exists, this is very easy. Also, importantly, are they doing just the wires or also the contract entails? Yeah. Okay, so first of all, this is only half the cost because the cost is half wire, half transformers. I'm not saying any transformers here. I'm saying things like lighting, power connections, and heating. I'm specifically not saying substations. So double the cost, and remember that it is and remember that it is also that it is also a line that is being built. So it's much easier to build concurrently because you have issues with construction windows. And actually, it's been a problem in Israel because in Israel, they had some windows, but they could only work 6 days a week. And when the project was flagging in the home stretch in 2019-20, that was during the government formation crisis. So the country was on a string of caretaker governments, and at one point, the Minister of Transport was not the NPC that was what's his. You see, I can't remember the guy's name. He was the Minister for Transport for Life, Israel Katz. Yeah, so Israel Katz, whose main contribution to the electrification project is that I don't even was aware that it existed, which is why it went relatively smoothly. Again, relatively, there was the lawsuit, but the costs were not insane. He was mostly running on building highway interchanges. And then, due to the reshuffle, like, he was one of the big honchos in Likud, right below Netanyahu, which is why I call him an NPC. All the interesting people at Likud left the party out of personal conflict with Netanyahu. One of these people, a former settler, religious guy, his name is Naftali Bennett, ended up taking over the the National Religious Party / Jewish Home, and is currently the prime minister in an anti-Netanyahu coalition. The other right-wing members or historically right-wing members of the coalition, Avigdor Lieberman and Gideon Sa'ar, they're also Likud refugees with poor personal relations with Netanyahu. Israel Katz was sufficiently not a personality that he remained loyal to Netanyahu all this time. So during the caretaker era, he got bumped up to something, and transport was given to an extremist named Bezalel Smotrich. His transfer policy was not especially extreme. I mean, he just held the line on no works on Saturdays ever. His main extremism is not anything about transportation. The extremism is that he believes that he believes that Israel should annex the territories and institute full apartheid, in which if the Palestinians do not accept that their status per halakhic law must be inferior to that of Jews, then they should be ethnically cleansed. This is what makes him extreme. But the point is, this guy, in addition to having extreme right political views, at the Ministry of Transport, rigidly forbade work on Saturdays. It was reasonable on other things. Like he said that, oh, okay, then do whatever you can to speed up the project in other ways, just never work on Saturdays. So that was a real issue, the construction windows. And it's important to have good windows, 5 hours. You probably want 6 hours of uninterrupted lack of service at night, which also means that you should not do freight at night. The way Boston works right now is there's a couple of freight trains a day. They tend to run them overnight because what is quiet for the residents. So what they should be doing is running them on the shoulders when there's less service is being ramped up or down. So not at 3 in the morning, but at 11 at night, for example. And then have uninterrupted time for maintenance between, let's say in normal service, 5 hours, 1 in the morning to 6 in the morning. And then you can claw back an hour if you need to do major construction. So then you don't actually have 5 hours. You have probably 4 hours because it takes time to ensure that everything's been shut down. But that's still time. I mean, it's still a problem. And for example, it's been a problem with the Green Line extension. One of the reasons the Green Line extension is expensive is they could not work around the clock, or they could not work normal hours. They had to work during nighttime closure, during nighttime closure windows, and so they had to do 4 hours at a time. And unfortunately, because they were doing it in a very strong economy, they could not pay people only for 4 hours of graveyard shift work. So they had to pay people for a full day. So there was a real problem with GLX, and this is going to drive your electrification costs up. I mean, it's not going to drive them. It should not drive them to GLX costs. It should not drive them even to Caltrain costs or Toronto costs. But it is a thing. And this is, at any rate, why this contract is not comparable, because this is not something that you're stuck doing in 4-hour graveyard shift windows. So you can ask. You can ask in comments if you have any follow-ups. I'm gonna go with autonomy. Yeah, the UK is gushing over EMUs. Yeah, the problem is that Britain and the United States learn bad ideas from each other. So Britain, which has a lot of problems with its electrification program, essentially because it's doing it too late, in the same way that Boston is not the frontier. Neither is Cardiff. Neither is the Great Western. Neither is the Midland. All of these things should have been wired generations ago. Again, Cardiff, I can see why it maybe should have been wired on generations ago, only decades. But this is but Cardiff specifically, the Cardiff Commuter Rail Network. So for people who don't know, one of the things that the Tories did when they won in 2010 is they did a review of the electrification program and changed its scope. They didn't change it in the political sense of we hate government spending, we think oil is good for you, so we're going to electrify less. It just essentially what I think happened is they did a review, and this was something the civil service was split on, in the same way that that in France actually during the transition from Sarkozy to Hollande, there were some changes to the Grand Paris Express project because things that are very much within the parameters of the program. They think they couldn't decide on what alignment to do, so they did both. And one of the things that are not bad that the coalition did is that they said that they would prioritize for electrification local lines over intercity lines. Electrification is the most important on local lines because we've talked about performance and electrification before. And not performance and electrification, performance and acceleration. The performance and acceleration benefits you gain from electrification. And the upshot is that this is much more important for local lines. And Cardiff is very unique within Britain because Cardiff has a very large commuter rail network, which is not common in Britain. Why does it have a large commuter rail network? Because South Wales used to be a coal mining region. So all of these were mineral railways. They were freight railways that were cobbled together to get coal from mines that you can even sometimes see on Google Earth. Like this is very clearly the remains of a mine. To customers, for example, in Cardiff, or more importantly, for transshipment from Cardiff to customers in London. And so there are a bunch of lines here that form a dendritic system, a bunch of short lines. So they became an electrification priority. And again, it's not a bad thing. It's just that there have been managerial problems. There's been an attempt to reinvent the wheel. They tried to automate the wiring for the Great Western Main Line. That failed. They're not quite learning from France and Germany the way they should. Lots of excuse mongering, and the upshot is maybe they're thinking it's too hard, and maybe that is imprinting on the United States and vice versa, which is a problem. Was it a good decision for Denmark to electrify 25 even though everyone else is 15? Yes, and here's why. 25 means more power than 15. A modern day locomotive or EMU that can do 15 kilovolt can do 25 and vice versa. The problem with interoperability is a one-way thing in which it is harder to operate AC than DC, and it is harder to operate low-frequency AC than high-frequency AC. So, and why is that? Because AC, the whole point of alternating current is that it involves stepping up and stepping down things with transformers. So the transformers, so it turns out that the size of the transformer is inversely proportional to your frequency. So you need a transformer of a certain size to do 15 kilovolts, 16 and 2/3 hertz. And you need a transformer of 1/3 that size to do any voltage, but at 3 times the frequency, which is 50 hertz, which is the standard one for Europe. 25 kilovolt, 50 hertz. So every German and every Swedish electric train can automatically run, maybe with small modifications, but small modifications can already run in Denmark when it on the electrified lines. Now, a Danish train might not interoperate because it might need a larger transformer. So first of all, they might need to get slightly heavier trains. It is a thing, by the way. So something that you might want to look at is the cost of the Pendolino, because the Pendolino is an early example of a modular product which started out no transformers because Italy is DC. And then they did versions that are multi-voltage for interoperability to France and then to Switzerland and Germany. And you can even see the weight go up a little for the version that is compatible with Germany and Switzerland, because Germany and Switzerland were 15 kilovolts, 16 and 2/3 hertz countries, whereas France is mostly 25 kilovolts, 50 hertz. Again, Italy is DC, so no such thing as frequency. And so Denmark, I think, made a good decision. If it had gone the other way, I don't think it would have been a terrible idea. I think Denmark, again, I think this is a good decision. But again, doing the other way, again, would have been a bad decision, but not like a why the hell are these people still working for the government kind of bad. By the way, are there any other questions? Let me check if my phone is out of battery. No, my phone is not complaining about lack of battery. It is complaining about other things. Let's wait until 8. Okay, so it's 7:56. It's going to be something like an hour 45 of recording, which is, I mean, I thought it would be an hour to an hour 30, but so any questions either about the report itself? What just happened? Okay, I have no idea why it decided to rotate, but I am not here for it. Okay, better. Or about electrification in general. Has anyone done work on the network effects? Not that I'm aware of. I know in Boston they're using network effects as an argument against electrification because it will be the first line and they want interoperability. Whereas it's actually the other way around because the early lines are the ones where ignoring interoperability issues have such amazing ROI, especially on the Providence line, which is almost again entirely wired modulo the parts like Attleboro needing the local tracks wired or electrifying the uh, yard in Pawtucket. And you can use the existing transformer already. You need to beef it up to run more trains, but there's actually room. So Amtrak does not usually do good projects, and Amtrak does not especially usually do good projects based on any kind of interoperability with the other users of the same lines. But credit where it's due, when it electrified New Haven to Boston, it asked the MBTA if it wants to participate. The MBTA foolishly said no, but Amtrak at any rate went ahead, and when it built its transformer, like its substation, it built it with room to expand should the MBTA choose to electrify. So they still need to actually do the expansion, but the land is there. It's owned by either Amtrak or the MBTA, I'm not sure which, but it's there and everything is fine. They just need to build the thing, and the thing in question costs, I believe, high single-digit million dollars. How long would it take to implement? I don't know, because we said 8 to 12 years, so aggressively. So we started writing in 2019, so we said 2017. Right now, but the thing is, they're not just starting right now. They're already started looking at train sets and hiring people to maybe oversee it, and they've done an RFI. But it's still very early in the process. My guess is that if they did it aggressively, the entire system is wired 2030, and the Providence line and the Fairmount line, which can hook up to the same transformer because it's very close. Maybe also the Franklin line, not sure. Get wired way earlier because again, the Providence line doesn't need to be wired. It needs to have a few tiny sections of wire next to main lines that are already wired. So it's just much easier. So my guess is Providence can be wired I mean, like running EMUs mid 2020s, fair amount, around the same time, maybe a bit later. The whole system late 20s, maybe early 30s. Um, this is my estimate. Again, it depends on how aggressive they are. The governor right now doesn't want to do it, so he keeps looking for excuses to delay and slow things down. But he will not live forever. Um, are there other questions? Oh, about what are my thoughts about electrifying highways for electric trucking? I don't know. I do not understand the trucking industry's logistics well enough to say yes, no, lol. I wish it would work. I think it would be a very beneficial thing. Um, the emissions caused by trucks are large. The uh, I do not know whether whether wire on highways would also reduce other problems caused by trucks. Like I imagine it would reduce noise, but probably the worst noise problems are not on the highway because the highways have so much noise already from cars and trucks that they're built with noise walls. The worst noise is trucks in cities. That is so maybe something where you do is some kind of in motion charging on the truck where it is charged where it's charging on the highway, and then it can go a couple kilometers into the city for like it's kind of a last mile solution in battery mode. I think that would be really good. As an environmental issue, as someone who has to deal with truck noise on my street. But I cannot quantify the benefits because, again, noise emissions are abnormally difficult to quantify. Essentially, the problem with noise pollution is that people don't notice how much it's hurting them. Like there's a study on this. There's this Kenyan study that I will. Where they no, not this one. So these are all environmental. So these are all, I'm sure, very good. Kenya study noise pollution. And no, not Kenya. Kenya diesel generator. Um, so let me summarize the study, which I linked to on Twitter. I just don't remember the link. The study is, I think, again, was done in Kenya. They had people solve a test, um, and as a kind of random variation, half of them had a noisy diesel engine work arrive nearby, so they had noise distraction, and the ones that had the noise distraction did a lot worse on the test than the ones that didn't. And then they continued the study by paying people for based on the performance on the test. So if they did better, they would get paid money, and they offered and then in that study they asked participants uh, if they were willing to pay a little bit of money to have the diesel engine shut down. Uh, and the way the incentive structure was set was that if the people were perfectly rational, they would say yes because the amount of money to pay for shutting down the diesel engine was less than the expected value of the on the test, which again was being paid. They were in the study, and they still said no irrationally. Essentially, the because not diesel because noise reduces your intellectual performance, but you don't notice that it's happening. So this is why it's really hard to quantify because you can't do the usual economic because you can you do the usual economic estimates of willingness to pay. So again, I can tell you about the benefits. I do not know the cost. I do not know the logistics. Yes, this is what Siemens is proposing. It's also what it's proposing for trams, which is a very good idea. No, not for trams. Sorry, for probably buses. For trams, it probably isn't because if you're already building the two tracks guess 4 tracks because right, because a railway is two rails, so 4 of these in the road. If you're building that, just wire already. Do it in the same time. Do it at the same time. It shouldn't be a problem. But again, if they can do in motion charging for trucks, that would be really good. But again, I cannot tell you I cannot tell you where this technology is on the spectrum between complete vaporware and essentially done just needs to happen. Things like, let's say, mass installation of utility grade solar and wind, where the costs of solar and wind and then onshore wind and offshore wind right now both are basically murdering everything else. Like, they're cheaper than keeping existing power plants online. I think they might be even cheaper than keeping existing nuclear plants online, which is insanely cheap. Nuclear plants are incredibly cheap to operate once you've paid the trillions of dollars it takes to actually build them. So I cannot tell you whether we're on the spectrum of lol vaporware, like fusion power, to just needs to happen and very easy this is, if that makes sense. I just think it would be a very good idea. And not just for climate reasons, because again, there are other environmental problems. I know I said 8, it's 8:06. Are there other questions? Could I give people more time to type them, just because there's always going to be a little bit of lag and typing is not instantaneous? If not, then let's try ending this at 8:50, at 8:10. Let's say 8:15 is an even 2 hours. If not, then thank you all for watching. Especially thank all the Europeans who are watching and asking me questions and nitpicking about what I'm saying about current and about British issues, and suffering through my talking about America and saying things that are kind of trivial in Europe, like they should electrify all of the commuter trains in the city that is substantially larger than Berlin. So thanks for watching, and if you're watching this on YouTube, I've already uploaded this. If you're watching this on Twitch, I will upload soon, and I will see you again in possibly a week, possibly 2 weeks with another video. So thank you.